to the Champions League fixtures tonight. Jurgen Klopp is in the papers talking about the hard truths that the team had to face after getting annihilated against Napoli. I have to do something. I can't sit there and wait for how we react. Is this the situation I wanted? No, but now you're in it, you find it challenging. We had a general meeting showing these situations, and they're too obvious. It wasn't needed to say a lot about it, but I did anyway. Then it goes on. Did I question the players? Generally, no. In this situation, yes. Why would you do that? Why would we do that? When James Milner arrives too late in a challenge and we lose at challenges where we would usually win, then you know something's wrong. There are 4 or 5 days now of absolute truth. We didn't hide anything. We didn't hold back anything. There was no need for that. Tonight's game against Ajax is a very, very big game for Liverpool as a result of the recent performances. I'm delighted to say Jonathan Wilson is with us this morning. Jonathan, good morning to you. How are you?
I'm very good, thanks. How are you?
This Liverpool game has taken on a very deep meaning after what Klopp is saying, and maybe a bit of misinterpretation around his post-match comments about needing to reinvent after the Napoli game. What do you expect from Liverpool tonight?
Well, I think it's a hugely difficult game. I mean, Ajax are playing really, really well. So before anything else, they've got to try and get 3 points. It's got to try and get this Champions League campaign up and running. I think it's pretty difficult for them because they don't really have any players. You know, the injuries have hit them to such an extent. It's not as many other players can come in. Not a lot of things you can change around. And you look at that side that played in Napoli last week, and maybe the fact they've had 6 days off, that's given them in a season when there's not much time. They have been presented with a bit of time to try and sort things out, and the fact they've got next weekend off as well now. It is sort of one game in a fortnight rather than one as a series of 4 in a fortnight. But they've got to first and foremost got to try and find some defensive solidity, which they'd lost. But that comes from the compactness that Klopp was talking about, and the fact that the spaces between the forward line and the defensive line, which I think he would ideally like to see at around about 25, 30 yards, had grown to an extent where there's just loads of space Napoli could play their way through. And it's not just Napoli. It's not this was a one-off game. Napoli was a team who were really able to exploit that. But I think you saw evidence of that even against Fulham on the opening day of the season.
So what is causing the compactness to not be compact anymore? Why does that happen?
Well, I think we saw it in the pandemic season as well. I think this is the issues are quite similar. That suddenly we're seeing Liverpool's defence looks incredibly ropey. And you're looking at Alexander-Arnold saying, well, hang on, we were talking about this kid as being potentially one of the great right-backs in the world. But actually, when he's put under defensive pressure, he's not great. Virgil van Dijk, who's been the best centre-back in the Premier League for 3 or 4 years, suddenly looks vulnerable. He's given away 2 penalties already this season. You get a run at him. But the point is, people are getting a run at them. They're getting a run in behind Alexander-Arnold, or they're getting a run at Van Dijk. It doesn't help Van Dijk. He's had 3 different partners, which again, like the pandemic season, they kept on chopping and changing, and then he got injured as well. The injuries have meant they haven't had consistency there. But it's to do with, I mean, and it's very hard from the outside to know. It's either players are not responding in the way they used to, that they're not putting in that physical and mental effort to enact the pressing systems. Or it's that fatigue is set in and they're not able to do that. So whether it's a physical issue or a mental issue or some combination of the two, somehow those very precise, very sophisticated pressing structures, which are so characteristic of Liverpool at their best, they have broken down in the way they did in that pandemic season, when I think fatigue and a lack of time to put it right was pretty obviously the cause. So this might be to do with the age profile of the squad, which I think we knew was getting older. It might be to do with new players coming in, not quite settling yet. It might just be to do with the fact that Liverpool played an unprecedented number of games last season and a short pre-season, short close season. Everybody's still worn out. It might be to do with the fact with Jurgen Klopps in his 8th year at the club, and eventually the impact of a manager starts to wear off, and no matter how charismatic he is, players start to drift a bit. And I think from the outside, it's very, very hard for us to know what combination of those factors it is.
Jonathan, just on that fatigue you mentioned, like it's funny now that Liverpool are going to be one of these Premier League clubs with essentially a month off Premier League action, the way the fixtures have panned out. Like, if you're Jurgen Klopp and in his position, do you reckon it's a good thing now that they're having this time to reset after a bad period, or is it a case that when you're playing that badly, you almost want the games to keep coming thick and fast in order to correct things?
No, I think this is good for them. I think this is really, I mean, it could cause problems down the line later in the season, but things were going pretty badly wrong. And I think once you get on a spiral like that, it's pretty hard to arrest. they suddenly do have time to arrest that. So I think this has probably worked out pretty well for them.
It's funny even reading Jamie Carragher's comments in I think it was in his Telegraph column in the last day or two as well. Like he's talking about the obvious things in the Liverpool team, but he mentioned James Milner as you did, Jonathan, but he also mentioned Roberto Firmino starting big games for Liverpool this season. Like this is a man in the last year of his deal, obviously playing for either a new contract or a move elsewhere, but like I think Carragher's quote was that he's been in decline for the last couple of years, Firmino, and all of a sudden he finds himself in this position of starting big games for Liverpool. Like would you go along those kind of similar lines, that Firmino is maybe lucky to be in the team, or have his performances so far this season maybe merited that selection?
I think he's been one of their better players this season in a pretty ropey selection. But I mean, really, who else is it? Darwin Nuñez has been suspended, and Jota's been injured. So in that central role, there is nobody else. And as I said, I think he's actually done okay. But you're right, he's been in decline for a couple of years, and we saw his influence last season. Definitely, he'd begun to wane. But I mean, I think the whole balance of that forward line is problematic now. That you had that front three that was so effective, and the attributes of Mane, Firmino, and Salah, they made each other better, and they worked very well as a unit. Well, as soon as you begin to fiddle with that, you damage the balance. So Salah, I think, really hasn't played well since the Cup of Nations. Now, that might be the effect of the Cup of Nations, that was a pretty difficult tournament for Egypt. I know they got to the final, but they played pretty horrible football. Salah was often very, very isolated, up the pitch on the right, often 30, 40 yards of space around him, having to work very, very hard, pretty thanklessly, under huge amounts of pressure from Egyptian fans, Egyptian press. And then to lose it on penalties in the final, and then to lose that World Cup playoff to also to Senegal on penalties, that would take its toll. I think if you look at his shots per game, the first half of last season, I think it was around about 4.8 per game, and I think it's been something like 2.8 since. I don't have the figures here, but I remember looking it up last week, and it was something like that. There's been a dramatic fall off in his shots per game. Now that's, as I say, partly might be to do with him and his psychological, mental, physical state. But also the other thing that happened in January was Luis Diaz came in. Now, Luis Diaz, I think by general consent, has done very well. He's settled very quickly. He's made a habit of scoring brilliant consolation goals. But if you've got him on the left and you move Sadio Mane into the middle, or Darwin Nuñez as your centre forward, that's a different profile of player to Jota or Firmino, who would drop out and create space for Salah to go into. So Salah, of necessity, is having to play wider. He's not getting into the box as much. That in itself is probably enough to explain that drop off in shots per game. And maybe he's sort of thinking, well, when he signed his new contract, was that really what he was signing up to not be the main man up front anymore, but to be this auxiliary figure on the right, rather than the sort of key figure in that front three. So I think Liverpool is just in one of those situations where everywhere you look in the team, apart from probably Alisson, there are issues with the balance, issues with individuals, and that forward line. Yeah, you can pick out Firmino and say that the fact he's playing suggests the injury problems they've got. You can look at Nuñez getting himself suspended, which has frustrated everybody. I think there's been suggestions, certainly in Spain and Portugal, that Liverpool is starting to wonder whether he really was the player that they wanted. I think you look at Salah and say he's not playing particularly well. But you can do that in the midfield, you can do that in the defence as well.
It's a mad systems failure from start to finish, with as you said, the exception of Alisson. While there is a little bit of time here, there's also time for the team to stew in the difficulties. And Klopp is talking about the honesty that they've had. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. It's where we seem to be at a hinge point anyway, where things could go really badly for the rest of the season. And when you list off the number of problems there are, you can fix one, but fixing them all at the same time is going to be very difficult, unless somehow Thiago wrestles the team into some kind of greatness on his own. Is that like, if I'm a Liverpool fan, my eggs are all in well, Thiago's back now, maybe he can start games for us?
Well, I mean, yeah, Thiago, I think, is very necessary to give him a bit of guile through midfield, and he can knit things together, and just the way he holds possession can help relieve pressure. So him coming back, not that you can rely on him, I think, to be fit for the rest of the season. I think that is a benefit. I think though, one when we talk about all the problems at Liverpool, they're all interrelated. So if you fix one, you do then start to fix others. And I think these things can, just as they can fall apart pretty quickly, I think they can probably be mended pretty quickly. Say Darwin Nuñez suddenly gets on a run and scores, I don't know, 6 goals in the next 4 games or something. Thiago knits things together. Matip is fit, and he and Van Dijk reform that partnership that was so commanding. Then suddenly Alexander-Arnold will look a better player, and confidence will spread. And if James Milner's not having to play, that relieves a bit of pressure on midfield. So I think the thing with Liverpool, the way they play, and it's in many ways it's the beauty of how they play, is such a. And I guess it's true of all great teams at the moment. It's true of Manchester City as well. These are very fragile, very complex mechanisms. One thing goes wrong, and it has a huge ripple effect. But equally, the opposite is true. If you start to put them right, things can, I think, be mended pretty quickly. Obviously, if they're all knackered, that's a different issue.
Yeah, and can 3 days rest actually help a team in the middle of the season enough to allow them to recover the energy that they seem to have been depleted? It's very difficult for us to know, and I guess maybe at the end of the season we'll find out a bit more about it too. But certainly it's one of the most interesting case studies of the best team in world football over the last 18 months, or one of the most exciting teams suddenly becoming very ramshackle in parts. That game against Napoli was like one of those games that I think we're all going to remember for a very long period of time, because it could really have been 7-1.
Yeah, it could have been. But I think what's really interesting is we've seen it before. I mean, don't forget, this is a team that lost 7-2 to Aston Villa 2 seasons ago. So we know that when things go wrong for Liverpool, they can go really, really badly wrong. I think even more than City, actually much more than City, Liverpool are a side who really play on the edge. And that's how they've overperformed in terms of their spending. That's how they're able to have kept so close to City for so long. City, I think, have a few more built-in safeguards. They can be a bit more cautious. They can hold possession. I think defensively they're a little bit more circumspect. Whereas Liverpool, it's hell for leather. And if you're playing that high up the pitch, and if you're playing with that level of intensity, and you're trying to overwhelm teams with that intensity, if that intensity drops, or if opponents can find holes within it, there's not much defence there to break through. So we saw it collapse 2 years ago. We saw it put right again last year. So I don't think the situation is in any sense terminal, but it is fascinating that it's happening again, and you do wonder how often you can fix that, particularly when you're looking at this season, and it's just game after game after game after game for months and months into the future.
Jonathan, just to touch on the cancellation of I know 7 of the 10 Premier League games go ahead this weekend, but still we have those few fixtures cancelled. I know that the statements released hinted at the policing issues and everything else. I know you wrote, I think it was in Sports Illustrated, maybe you wrote during the week about the fact that you were in a cricket stadium, I think, when news were starting to filter through of the Queen's failing health. And you pointed out that maybe a sports stadium is the perfect place for people to pay tribute in their own little ways. Are you surprised now at this stage where we are looking at the games specifically cancelled this weekend? Maybe you can understand the Chelsea game at 4:30 on a Sunday evening, the day before the funeral, but then you have United Leeds in Manchester, a couple of 100 miles up the motorway, being cancelled earlier on a Sunday as well. So it's a bit of a bizarre one. Certainly people on this side of the sea are trying to make sense of it, but what's your take on it from over there?
I think it's actually much more understandable this weekend than last. Last, I think there was, what I was talking about in that Sports Illustrated piece was, I think an event like this, it's a national event, and a national event is probably best experienced in public, not just sitting at home watching it on telly. And I say this as somebody who is absolutely not a monarchist. But I was sort of, looking forward to is a terrible phrase, but I was sort of sitting there at the Oval watching the rain come down on Thursday, thinking, if the announcement comes this afternoon and I hear it over the tannoy at the Oval with other people and hear their reactions, that is going to be incredibly poignant and incredibly memorable. Watching the flag being lowered would have been incredibly poignant and incredibly memorable. I was at the theatre last night, and because it was a royal theatre, there was a minute's silence, and God Save the King played after that. And that normally would put my hackles up. But last night I was sort of, actually, this is really moving, and I will always remember that. And I think we could have had that in football last weekend. I think the policing issues make it unavoidable for certain games this weekend. I mean, South London at the moment is just crazy. I was walking through Westminster and Pimlico last night. So I actually went past Westminster Hall. Just because that was where I was going. I wasn't going particularly to have a look. And there's barriers everywhere. There's police everywhere. They're talking about queues of maybe up to 20 miles long. So obviously that is a huge drain on policing resources. So I think Chelsea, in terms of proximity, plus the fact Chelsea-Liverpool obviously takes extra policing. I'm assuming the fact it's Manchester United Leeds, it's just a high-risk fixture. So maybe they have to move in. I don't know if they're having to move police from Manchester down to London to cope with the crowds, or whether normally they move police from London up to Manchester to deal with a game like that. But I can understand that. And then the other game is Brighton Palace, which has been cancelled because of rail strikes, and now the rail strikes have been cancelled, but the game was already cancelled before that. So that's a pre-existing complication. It isn't really to do with the funeral. So I think this weekend, the issues of policing, and I say this obviously as somebody with no great insight into how policing works, but I can understand that if the police say no, that we can't do this, fair enough. I think the previous weekend was where the mistake was made.
There are weekends, pardon me, later in March and April, which are kind of contingency weekends when most teams will be out of the FA Cup, where they should be able to make up these fixtures. Do you think it's going to be a significant issue down the line, or actually, if we'd had a really cold snap and everything had been frozen out for 10 days, they would find a way to make these fixtures work?
Well, I mean, this season of all seasons, I think it's going to be really difficult. I mean, I know there's the FA Cup weekends, but can you rely on Manchester United, Liverpool, Chelsea all being out of the FA Cup? I think there's a significant chance they all could still be in the FA Cup come quarter-final weekend or semi-final weekend. So I think, yes, that's a possibility, but you can't rely on that. This season, I just think we're seeing the chaos of the schedule at the moment. There's just too much in it. That there's no wriggle room, there's no breathing space. The fact that Champions League is coming, essentially 6 weeks in a row with an international break stuck in the middle of it. So all 6 games within 9 weeks. There's no space. There's no time to breathe. And what happens if we do get a cold snap in January? What happens if games are called off because of snow or because of frozen pitches? What if the rail strikes proliferate, which I think there's every chance they could? There's nowhere to go. So I think you're sort of seeing the folly of a fixture list that is as rammed as it is, quite apart from the impact on footballers and journalists. Let's be honest, we're all knackered as well. If you have to build in space for some cancellations, because whether for politics, whether for world events, whatever, games might have to be called off, and you want to keep it fair. You don't want teams going for a title or battling relegation having to play 3 games in 5 days or something.
We may well be on course for that as the season goes on. There's one last thing I just wanted to ask you about. From my perspective, you're in the middle of a discussion about what the definition of a counterattack is at the moment. You've opened a can of worms that maybe you didn't even think was a can of worms in the first place.
Well, yeah. So what happened was I was saying the 3 goals Manchester United scored against Arsenal were not dissimilar to the sort of goals they scored on Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, and I slightly carelessly said counter-attacking goals. What I meant was goals in which you use quick forwards against a high line. But I then think it's worth asking, what is a counter-attack, and indeed what is attacking? And I came up against this a few years ago when Louis van Gaal was manager of Manchester United, that Louis van Gaal would tell you his teams were very attacking because they always had the ball. So he would say they were proactive. If we got the ball, by definition, we're attacking. I think it's more complicated than that. And you also see it with people who think, say, Germany at the 2010 World Cup, because they put 4 past England and put 4 past Argentina. Oh, they're a great attacking side. They weren't. They were counter-attacking. They sat deep and they played on the break. They played in transition. But for some reason, the word counter-attack has this, or maybe not counter-attack, but counter-attacking. If you say you're a counter-attacking team, it's got this sort of moral quality of someone being slightly dubious, which I don't think there's any reason why that should be. There's fundamentally 2 ways of playing, with the ball and without the ball, and both are fine for me. And your way of playing can be to try and draw the opposition on and hit the space behind them, or it can be to control possession and control the game that way and try and pick spaces in the way that, say, Spain did at the 2010, 2012 World Cup and the European Championship. It can be exciting or not exciting according to the team, but I just sort of think attack is a very, very hard word to define in football.
I don't know if it's true or not. I saw on Twitter yesterday somebody was suggesting that it was the anniversary of the famous Brian Clough, Don Revie thing.
Yeah, it's 48 years ago yesterday. Yeah,
the whole notion of we're going to do it better. We won't be counter-attacking. We'll be controlling the game. It's like, and Pep probably feels like there's a moral quality to not being a counter-attacking team, but the rest of us, as mere mortals, surely we want to win.
Yeah, well, I mean, and Clough wanted to win. I mean, look at his Forest side that won the league. They won 4-0 away at Old Trafford. I think was it Boxing Day, 77? And there's a great interview with Peter Taylor after that game. If it wasn't Boxing Day, it was December time sometime. And there's a great interview with Peter Taylor where somebody, whoever's doing the interview says, "Oh yeah, what a brilliant dominant display," and Peter Taylor goes, "Well, you won't see that again this season." And they then just shut up shop, and they draw an incredible number of games 0-0 in the second half of that season because they've already got the lead and they're clinging on to it. So Clough was, for all this talk, he was quite happy to kind of draw games 0-0 if it suited him. But he would do that not by sitting deep, but by holding possession. You look at how Forest won the European Cup. Both finals were 1-0. There's a lot of 1-0s, a lot of 0-0s in those European campaigns. So, yeah, he could talk about playing the game in a beautiful way and holding possession. Forest could be pretty tedious to watch at times as well.
Just finally for me, Jonathan, you have the book out very recently, I think, on the lives of the two Charlton brothers, the life and times of Bobby and Jackie Charlton. Like, some great anecdotes, and I know I was reading an interview you did there recently talking about the influence of Match of the Day coming on board in 64 and 65, and I guess how that catapulted football onto a bigger stage, and that's probably something people of my generation don't appreciate enough, maybe. And I know you've spoken as well about I think, wasn't it on stage, the BBC Sports personality one year where Jack spoke very fondly about Bobby, but Jack is obviously someone especially who's revered in this country for obvious reasons. Were there any anecdotes or things you even learned yourself about the two brothers over your time researching the book?
Oh, it was a huge amount. I mean, I think with figures who are as well known as that, there's two slightly different things you're doing with the book, or three. So the thing I actually really wanted to do was to put them in a sort of socio-political context, because I realised actually they represent two different strands of British life, or British and Irish life, in the late 20th century. The Bobby, very conservative, very sort of cautious. Jack, much more radical. And I think Jack, you can see, very much comes through that sort of mid-60s Harold Wilson, White Heat technology, scientific systems-driven innovation, whereas Bobby was much more of the old school, and that's reflected both in football and their wider personalities. Then you're also trying to find just new details and so, I mean, a story that I certainly didn't know, and I suspect it's not particularly widely known, was when Bobby was manager of Preston, which didn't go well. He's only in charge for 2 years. He gotten relegated, couldn't get promoted again. But the Preston didn't want to sack him. The Preston board didn't want to be the board who sacked Bobby Charlton. So they sort of contrived a situation to force him to resign by selling a player called John Bird to Newcastle. And the details of that and the sort of slightly bonkers conspiracy. I mean, it almost feels like a sitcom. These sort of these business owners in Preston sort of running around trying to manipulate the situation. And what makes it even better is John Bird, who went on, actually had a very good career at Newcastle, and he's now a gallery owner and painter. He's like an artist, a really interesting bloke in his own right. So that was just stuff I didn't know. And then the other thing is going through the myths and actually sorting out what's true and what's not. Jack is somebody who myths accumulate around, and trying to work out what's true and what isn't can be pretty difficult at times. But hopefully, by talking to enough people, I've managed to sort of work my way through those and get towards something closer to the truth.
Well, hopefully you sell a gazillion copies of it, Jonathan. Great to have you with us this morning. Thanks a million.
Cheers, thank you very much.
It's Jonathan Wilson there, and I know that the Even Show are going to talk to him in greater depth about the book in the very near future.